have with us on set this morning CEO in the Ministry of Investment, Trade and Commerce, Duane Belisle. Good morning.
Good morning.
We also have with us Andy Sutherland. He is the Director General, the Directorate of Foreign Trade. Good morning. And of course, there's also Terrence Simfukwe, who is the National Trade Advisor for the Commonwealth Secretariat. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
The launch of the Belize's first national trade policy. What are we looking at?
Well, you want me to go?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right. Well, first, let's put it into context. Belize is a member of the WTO. It's also an integrating member of the Caribbean community. And as such, both international and regional institutions require that countries maintain a very well articulated trade policy. Over the years, while we do trade and we export, we have not prudent, well, maybe it's a wrong choice of words, but we have not instituted a trade policy of our own to leverage the rules and rules of the WTO and the opportunities that exist within CARICOM and the wider international trading arenas. So our drive over the last 2 or 3 years have been to develop a national trade policy for Belize, and we did that in concert with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and we're about to launch that February 28th this year.
And who were your local counterparts? Did you do consultations with those who'd be directly affected?
Indeed.
Yes, we did.
We conceived the policy, we drafted the outline in conjunction with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and we embarked on a nationwide consultative agenda. We went north, Belize City, west, in both Spanish Lookout and the San Ignacio community. We went south as well, and in Belmopan. And over a year and a half, we've garnered and we harnessed the opinions of all the known productive sector and civil society to be able to have a good sense of what the challenges are, what their expectations are in terms of delivering on this policy. And I think we've done a decent job to context what we found, what we determined would be the best approach for GOB to address some of these challenges, if not all.
How much would this policy change what is the status quo currently for those from the productive sector?
Well, the policy, as you know, government policy is that. It's a prescribed set of actions by GOB and other actors towards a desired end. In this instance, we're looking at Horizon 2030 and the implementation tool, which is the GSDS Growth and Sustainable Development Strategy launched by GOB in 2016. And this policy is one step further, looking to actualize the critical success factor, number 1, of the GSDS to optimize national income. And here we're looking at improving the business environment. We're looking at trying to enhance the productive sector capacity to export. We're looking at regionalism and to context regionalism in a way that we can take advantage of the opportunities that exist.
Now, CEO, let's talk about what have been some of the identified challenges for the productive sector, and it's been everything from the cost of doing business, the time and turnaround sometimes, because we do have what people call antiquated systems, and I know Terrence definitely can shed light on the cost of even exporting because of our location and fuel costs. So let's talk about how much these were a part of the consideration in the policy itself.
I think they were to a great extent. In terms of trying to reduce the cost of doing business for the private sector, there's quite a bit that's being done by government apart from the trade policy to address those issues. As much as possible, we're trying to put our services in the realm of e-services, so people can apply for permits online, license online, without having to travel from rural areas to a city or a town to get those services. So that's a step in the right direction in terms of reducing cost of business.
and other factors in terms of, I mean, I know a lot of times we hear from the productive sector, they need incentives, they need reductions in some of the costs that are associated, whether it's importing packing materials,
Right.
or even looking at the fuel costs of getting their materials out.
Right, that's true. We currently have two primary incentive programs that provide relief to companies. One is the recently revamped designated processing areas. You would be aware that that has replaced what was known as the EPZ in the past. And we also have our fiscal incentive program that provides relief in terms of exemptions from duties, civil exemptions, and things like that.
Perhaps this is a broad question. I'll ask nonetheless. What is the ease of doing business between Belize and any other CARICOM country, for instance, in terms of trades for commodities like rice, perhaps sugar cane, that sort of stuff?
Well, maybe let me chip in on that one. It is a broad question indeed, and first of all, how would you measure that ease? That could be maybe the starting question. I mean, the starting point. There are currently different parameters that are used on a global scale or even domestically. For example, we have the famous one done by the World Bank. It's known as the Trading Across Borders, as well as the Ease of Doing Business report. So it is done every year. So at each particular period, you can see how your country is ranked. So there are a set of parameters, like 10 parameters, like registering a business to insolvency. So these 10 parameters, access to credit, cost of energy, and all those things. So each country is surveyed. And recently, I could remember we were trying to answer some questionnaires and surveys through Ministry of Economic Development on how now we would be ranked. And this report is shared globally, and you can download and see that. So in terms of the ease, depending on, say, for example, the reforms that you might have as a country, and they put in place a lot of factors and assumptions. So from Belize's perspective, when we were going around, there are a lot of factors that came around in terms of the private sector saying, some of the issues that we face could be related to the cost involved in manufacturing, in producing, and later on in exporting. So we may not establish the ease in terms of currently this is the ease of doing business, but the thing is that in the framework of the whole structure of Belize as a business environment, we need to address certain issues that have been identified.
Issues like?
Issues like the cost of energy. This was one of the major issues that came out when we were doing the consultations. So the private sector was saying, cost of energy is high, for example, electricity and even diesel itself. So they say these things ultimately go to the consumer in terms of price. So we have looked at that, and we acknowledge that it is a key issue, and so we have discussed amongst ourselves, and we have made recommendations that this issue must be escalated even to the highest national management, because it's not only a ministry issue, it is a national issue. So we got to look at the cost of inputs, the cost of energy, if we have to move trade and develop our economy.
If I could just add, in terms of the issue of accessing other markets, I know that Belize is committed to doing a time-release study. That's a part of the trade facilitation agreement that we signed with the WTO a few years ago, and that will look specifically at clearing up some of the bottlenecks in that process from the time a good enters port to when it's cleared by a broker and in the hands of a distributor. So that's something that we're looking at that will happen within this year, I think.
And some of the identified weaknesses, I think even with a policy, and that's what I'm hearing from you, it cannot be fixed with a policy. It has to be kind of a higher level decision, from things like accessibility to ports, cost of using a port, the diesel. And if we look specifically, and I think that's what Isani was getting at with CARICOM, one of the main criticisms of looking at a single market is that Belize, being where it's positioned, is already disadvantaged simply because of the distance. How will a policy make us even more competitive to these island states who can just hop on a boat?
The policy sits on 4 pillars. One of those pillars, as the CEO said, is enhancing trade facilitation.
Yeah.
And trade facilitation has to do with decreasing the trade cost, meaning the ex-factory cost, to the point where it lands in a foreign country for a sale or whatever. So the trade facilitation agreement by the WTO looks at improving transparency for traders, meaning that traders would have access would have the right to access the entry requirements of another party, the domestic regulations that governs how goods move from out of the country, and any legislation that impacts trade. The productive sector and the general public would have a right to comment. That agreement also focuses on reducing the requirements for documentation and in some respects trying to best endeavors to reduce fees and costs. And it also looks at how goods move between and through countries in terms of in-transit goods. And as such, Belize has ratified that agreement in 2015, and we've instituted a National Committee on Trade Facilitation, and we are working with all the border agencies towards implementing that agreement. We're doing this in conjunction with CARICOM because they have also articulated a regional strategy for trade facilitation implementation. And as such, they're harmonizing the approaches to these, to implementing the various measures of that agreement so that trade within CARICOM would benefit more from that easing in terms of documentation, clearance procedures. Of course, this does not address freight. But then you have to look at the wider CARICOM. CARICOM just signed, I think they call it International Transport Agreement. The exact nomenclature eludes me. But that agreement would allow the establishment of new shipment routes between CARICOM. Hopefully, that context the situation faced by Belize, having to go to Miami and then to CARICOM. But nonetheless, even with the challenges, CARICOM remains Belize's 3rd largest trading partner. You have the UK, the US, and then CARICOM.
Yeah.
So if we could get marginal gains in terms of accessing the CARICOM markets and the easing of trade costs to get there, that would mean significantly that more for the productive sector in Belize.
Why don't we hear of, while I understand, as you mentioned, the United Kingdom, the United States, and of course CARICOM being 3rd, we're not hearing about Central American countries that Belize does business with in respect of trade. Can someone speak on that?
Yeah, sure. In the development of the policy, we had to consider, we did a SWOT analysis, and we had to look at where our strengths are currently, where do we do a lot of trade. And we also looked at the region close to us, within the region, Mexico, Guatemala, and Central American counterparts economy. So we're talking about, for example, a population of about 45 million people within Central America. So that's a huge market. It's maybe 5 times bigger than the CARICOM market. So in our policy, we have identified that as a good quick win.
Yeah.
So we have made proposals in the policy that we need to look at this market next door. And it's not that there's no trade taking place between Belize and the region. Currently, there's trade taking place and some goods are going through.
Yeah.
The challenge that is there is to, logistical issues in terms of transportation and all that. The regimes must be aligned and harmonized. We're coming from an English perspective, they're into Spanish. So there are a lot of issues to realign, but in short, we are saying let's look close by. Yeah. And so we have an eye on that, and we should be able to tap into this huge market over there.
It's always seemed like such a common sense solution for us to go more in our backyard rather than thinking of freight costs of getting as far as CARICOM or the US or the UK. But one of the things, we had the Mexican Chamber of Commerce representatives here quite a while, and there's a great demand for some of the goods that we do produce. But one of the barriers is the standards. And I want to ask you how much the policy is looking at ensuring that Belize will have adequate standards, Belizean producers will have adequate standards in place to meet any market that shows an interest.
If I may, you're right. Entry into any market is based on quality standards and food safety. Mm-hmm. And this has been some of the key challenges for the productive sector. The policy does context the need for not only the private sector but government institutions that provide these type of services and accreditation, that their capacities be developed so that they could provide the necessary services to the productive sector as well. But before you mentioned, I want to go back to Mexico and Central America. We do have a partial scope agreement with Guatemala. It was originally conceived as part of the confidence building measures between Belize and Guatemala, and we do have a signed agreement which Guatemala ratified in 2010. Mm-hmm. Trade has been occurring between Belize and Guatemala unimpeded, and as such, but however, there is a trade deficit between Belize and Guatemala, Belize and Mexico. This occurs because although we have an agreement, it's a partial scope agreement, and it contexts 78 lines of goods. But the majority of the trade that happens between Belize and Guatemala happens outside of the partial scope agreement. We managed to convene. After 2010, we managed to convene the Administrative Commission, which is the administrative structure that implements the agreement for both countries. And we've held 2 such meetings since 2010. Mm-hmm. Our last meeting was 2015, and we had agreed to explore the possibility of expanding the partial scope agreement. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the series of events occurred, and as such, the diplomatic and trade talks between Belize and Guatemala at least has been challenged, and we have not been able to progress in terms of expanding the partial scope agreement with Guatemala. In terms of Mexico, the policy does context the need to develop stronger trade relations through agreement with Central America. And our priority is Mexico, and we have been working assiduously on the ground trying to get Mexico to the table, and we've been doing this since 2013. Just before the government changed it last time, we are at a point where we're almost concluded with a framework agreement that would lay out the parameters for negotiations. And as such, that the change of government in Mexico, the challenge by the US in terms of NAFTA, place those issues as priority over the partial scope. However, now that the new government is seated, we have reached out to them, and at the diplomatic and political levels, there is agreement to move forward, and we're in high gear trying to be ready for when that agreement does kick off. We envisage that by first quarter 2020, we would have concluded an agreement with Mexico. And we have done extensive consultations across the country with the private sector, and we have a good idea of the products that our productive sector wants to get into Mexico. So the wheels are turning with Belize, Mexico, and hopefully this time around we will be fruitful in concluding a partial scope.
Let me just bring another issue into this, and I'm going to get CEO's response to this, because the trade deficit that we have in this country is a problem. And it has been for many, many years. We're getting ready to see the new presentation of the budget in just a few months, and we will see, of course, that we are importing far than we're exporting. We're not making sufficient revenue by what we're selling outside. And while tourism has been able to really help in filling that gap, a more reliable source is from what we're selling outside our borders. How will a national trade policy initiate the change that we need to see where Belize becomes a more productive society and we see stronger trade taking place?
That's an excellent point, Marlene. The whole objective of the national trade policy is to foster growth. Growth is driven by two things. One, global demand for your products, and two, your ability to meet that supply. We face supply side constraints in Belize in terms of access to financing, the high cost of inputs for producers. So those are things that we want to address through the national trade policy to give our private sector a chance to be competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Do you feel, I mean, we hear from BTEC, from Beltrade about all this push towards entrepreneurship, but it doesn't seem that we're actually seeing the fruits of all these laborers yet. There are tons of things. As a non-business person, I see there's a demand for in the States. Let's say moringa, which is like new superfood across the globe, which we have here in abundance, or other things. But we don't see all these entrepreneurship efforts translating into an increase in trade. Why is that?
My sense is that generally, as a people, I think we are risk averse. However, I think that trend is changing slowly. I know that through the Small Business Development Center, SBDC of Beltrade, they're working a lot with the youths to get them to realize and act on their entrepreneurial drive. That segment of the population may naturally have more so than maybe the more mature people that may be a little more settled in terms of how they view business and private sector engagement.
Is it, and you mentioned, I think you've all mentioned it before, is it access to finance that is also one of the main hindrances?
Yes, it is.
And how does the policy assist in that?
May I chip in on that? Your point is quite big and broad. And
Which one?
The issue of how to produce what the market is there, but why don't we realize? So there is no one single solution. The CEO has talked about some things. And may I add also that there's a whole compendium of factors that also border on demographics, for example. We have the youth here who are 2/3 of the national population. When I look at the statistics, the majority of the population are young people under 35. Now, how do we garner this cadre of youths who are very energetic, and how do we direct that energy into what? It has to be into productive thinking. So somebody might not think this is a trade-related issue, but to some extent, because we want to look at entrepreneurship, but then who are these guys to be entrepreneurs? They are the young people. So we have talked about that in the policy because we realize we have this, human resource. They have to be energized. Like CEO was saying, there's some level of risk, averseness in the young people. So they have to be directed properly. We need to bring up skills development centers. How many youths would be willingly saying, I want to do some agricultural project or even do a garden in my yard? So it has to be about perception. So a lot of youths here all think business administration certificate or diploma. I have to go to college. But we need to start thinking things like youth development centers in terms of how to grow vegetables. Even if you do a survey of the young people here, how many are thinking of, let me grow a garden of cabbage and sell? None would do that. So we have thought through these items. Yes, we want to be entrepreneurs, but there are some issues at the base there that we need to take care of. And these are some of the issues that we have identified. So we need to redirect this energy and put in certain mechanisms that are going to help us have a perceived change in terms of paradigm and all that.
Well, that's a cross-cutting issue, which leads me to the question, how much do you liaise with other government departments? Because this would be, I mean, if we continue to have where students major in business administration versus how to start your own business, then we perhaps won't see much of a change within the recent times. What's the dialogue with the other governmental departments?
We've been very involved in collaborating with other government agencies. From a trade standpoint, Terrence mentioned, well, the discussion is centered around entrepreneurship. A key component of that is access to information. What's out there? How can I benefit from market access into CARICOM or any other trade arena that we have an agreement with? And what we've been doing is analyzing the trade data coming out of CARICOM. If you are aware, CARICOM maintains a common external tariffs and a system of derogation through suspension of the CET. That's a common external tariff. And as such, that leaves behind a paper trail of the demand that are unmet within CARICOM. And it numbers in hundreds of products, millions of dollars. And what we've been doing is packaging this information and sharing this information with Beltrade, with Ministry of Agriculture, with a whole cross-section of other government ministries, and also the productive and private sector as well. One of the initiatives that we've seen come to fruition from this is the export of crude soybean oil to Jamaica. That is a direct benefit from our efforts that we've been doing. So indeed, there's a lot of energy within the young population. Access to finance is an issue, but then there are opportunities and possibilities out there. And we've been trying to marshal those opportunities and share that with the productive sector and everybody. One of the initiatives being spearheaded by another unit of this ministry, the investment unit, they're working with the central bank in trying to develop a collateral registry for movable assets. And as such, small business person would be able to, once this is implemented, would be able to collateralize their movable assets to be able to access funding. It's in the conceptual stage. I think it's the World Bank, if I'm correct, that did an initial study on this, and within the near future, we'll move towards trying to institute this for Belize.
If I could just add to the point that Andrew made about the access to finance, it's important to note that Beltrade has formed strategic partnerships with DFC as well as the National Bank of Belize. So the arrangement there is that Beltrade screens and vets projects for feasibility, and also to ensure that they can comply with the requirements of the National Bank and DFC, and then in return DFC and National Bank will fund the projects that they see as feasible.
We're hearing of more startup projects, so to speak, where you have an idea for a small business and you want to go through the process of doing things the proper way. So you probably seek advice from SBDC, for instance.
Right.
And then you go through other units of Beltrade that helps you to bring that idea to fruition. But we're not hearing much about perhaps medium and larger businesses or concepts for medium and larger businesses. Is there a reason why there's only particular focus being placed on small businesses as opposed to any other venture along that scale?
Yeah, in my view, I don't believe that Beltrade discriminates based on size. I think it's more they respond to demand. So if an investor or a potential entrepreneur has a project in mind, they can approach Beltrade and easily get services in terms of how to flesh that out and make it a reality.
What do you envision will be the change once the national trade policy is officially launched? What difference is it going to make?
Okay. We are going into into the unknown, so to speak. Unknown in the sense that we haven't, the future is not yet there, but we know we got the eyes to see. So we haven't had a policy, and so we know the environment in which we operate domestically and from the global perspective. So first of all, the message that we are sending across to all our stakeholders and partners is that let's walk this journey together. It's not about, oh, this is a government thing, this is a government document. So the message that we've been sharing with our private sector partners and many others is that we are in this together. If we need to develop our trade and our economy, government and private sector, both of us have to walk ahead. And the message we emphasize even when we launch this policy on the 28th is this same one. So the change we foresee is that we need to re-engineer our business processes, how we do things, because it's in our policy in there. So we want to walk the talk, so to speak. So we just don't want to have this policy and it lies there and gathers dust. Yeah. So that's the change that we envision, and we are convinced in ourselves as a team of government officials and the people we are working with. We say, let's give it a different shot so that we can bring a new dawn in the way we do things. Otherwise, we will not be sitting here and promoting this thing if we are not convinced that it's going to make progress and it's going to bring in some change. So we are definitely convinced, and we believe that what is in the policy, we are committed to actualizing it. That's the change that we foresee.
And if I can add, I envisage two more benefits of the NTP. One is better coordination across all the relevant regulatory agencies that play a role in promoting trade. The document is quite clear in laying out some of the challenges and the issues that we face, but those challenges do not only sit with the ministry. It's across the system in terms of how to get more efficient services from customs and BAHA and Bureau standards and all of that. That's one. Number two, I also anticipate that we should get more funding to address some of the bottlenecks that we identify, because our development partners, they want to see trade growth, private sector development, but they want to see it being addressed in a holistic fashion. The NTP does that.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you for coming in and giving us some of the issues covered in the trade policy. And of course, it will be launched, as you said, on the 28th of February.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we will be talking to activist and attorney Lisa Showman as we talk about what laws exist in cyberbullying. So stay tuned.